What's going on, guys? I'm Joe, and today I'm here to continue my series of Spider-Man reviews with Spider-Man 3. Oh boy. If I sound a little congested, I apologize. I have a bit of a sore throat, and I'm still getting over it, so just bear with me. Hopefully my voice doesn't give out while I talk about this. So, let's talk about Spider-Man 3. After the success of Spider-Man 2, I was ecstatic for Spider-Man 3. I watched all of the trailers, all the TV spots, looked up every single piece of information that I could find online, and I watched that exclusive clip of Harry and Peter fighting each other for the first time at least 50 times, I don't know. And going into the theater on opening night, I was pumped and I was ready. I mean, riding the high off of Spider-Man 2, how can I not be excited? And then by the time it ended and walking out, I was in a state of denial for quite a long time. And it wasn't until a few years later where I finally admitted to myself, yeah, it wasn't that good. It is probably one of the most disappointing movies that I have ever seen in my life. But is it the worst movie I saw? No. I have seen a lot worse. We'll talk about that later on, but I've seen much worse than Spider-Man 3. But it was one of the most disappointing films that I have ever seen. And it was the first time that I can ever recall Phantom menacing, as Chris Stuckman would say. It was my Phantom Menace for a long time, at least until Man of Steel came out, 6 years later. And if you ask certain people what's one of the worst comic book movies you've ever seen, you're likely going to see Spider-Man 3 on that list for various reasons. The muddled plot points, the multiple characters, and of course, the controversial dance scenes, which I'm going to address, and I'm going to try to counter some of the arguments that have been made. While some of them are justifiable, I think some of them have been blown out of proportion because this film is an easy target, and a lot of it has to do with the dancing scenes, of course, and various other things. But now that it's been 10 years since this came out, what do I think of Spider-Man 3? I sat down and watched it last week. I hadn't watched it in quite some time, and I actually don't hate it. I don't think it's terrible. Some of you are probably going to accuse me of being too soft on it, but I actually don't think it's that bad as people make it out to be, because, like I said, I think people have gone overboard with the hatred. I think it's an entertaining, yet average movie at best. So what's the story? Peter's finally found success in his personal life and his superhero life, and is feeling ready to propose to Mary Jane, but then faces the threats from Harry, Sandman, and Eddie Brock, who later becomes Venom, while also dealing with more relationship drama from Mary Jane and his discovery of the black suit negatively affecting his emotions. I mean, I'm glad I managed to pile that in as tightly as I can, but really, when you watch this, of course, as it's been stated in the last 10 years, there's too many characters in here. There's way too much going on. And I'll talk about how I would have done it differently, but watching it recently, it feels a lot longer than I remembered. I mean, it's like 2 hours and 20 minutes long, which really isn't that long if you keep the story very fluid and moving at a very good pace, keeping you enticed in what's going on. But because there's so much happening in here, it makes it feel a lot longer than it should be, because one plot point's being introduced, then it gets shoved to the side for another to come in, and it makes it really hard to focus on what's going on and getting inside the characters' heads. On the other hand, as opposed to Amazing Spider-Man 2, which we will talk about, this actually has a narrative through line. It tries to actually have a thematic arc of some kind, and it feels and plays like an actual movie. And as far as the WTF moments go in this movie, there's only really two that stick out in my mind, such as this scene.
There's a change in the silicon mass.
Yeah, it's probably a bird. It'll fly away when we fire it up.
A bird? I mean, what? Are you kidding me? And then Harry's butler saying, the blade that pierced his body came from his glider. Well, couldn't you have told him that earlier, and he could have avoided all this trouble? It's so dumb. Why would you wait that long to finally tell him what happened? And I'm probably going to come off a little negative with some of the things in here, but to reiterate what I said, I don't think it's that bad as people say it is. I have my critiques with some of the characters, but there's also some things to like about Spider-Man 3. Let's start with the characters. Peter Parker. People horribly exaggerate just how terrible he is in Spider-Man 3, and they especially horribly over-exaggerate how terrible Tobey Maguire supposedly was. He is far from terrible. The problem is not with Tobey. He is not to blame for this. I don't care how many people try to justify it with whatever Doug Walker says or whoever else. He is not to blame here. And it's the writers that wrote this character also. Peter needed a really big rewrite in this one. Especially with his moral code, because his moral code, while he's the black suit Peter Parker, it's completely screwed up. We know that Sandman survives, but he thinks he's killed Sandman. Stop right there. That should be the point where he stops himself before he lets the water come out and say, wait, no, I'm going too far here. Or at least afterwards, and he has a moment where he goes, oh no, what have I done? They even have that moment in the 90s show where he's about to throw Shocker off of the church tower, but he just melts Sandman and says, good riddance. And they have that moment in the 90s show.
Get back here, Shocker! Shocker!
You can't escape me! I'll chase you to the ends of the earth! And I hope that moment's in Homecoming. But with the other stuff, he's finally found success in his personal life with Mary Jane and as Spider-Man. He's now being appreciated as a real hero by the people of the city after he saved it twice. It's a little obnoxious in certain scenes, but in terms of the overall trilogy, it makes more sense as to why he's finally getting appreciated for what he's doing. And Peter is still reasonably likable nonetheless, with his mother and son bond that he has with Aunt May, him trying to support Mary Jane when she gets a bad review from the critics in her play, and seeing him and Harry rekindle their friendship after he gets amnesia. Although, the moments where he kisses Gwen upside down, and his whole attitude of like, I'm so wonderful, they love me, they are a little too much and they make me go, Peter, come on, you're better than that. But if you think about it, Peter hasn't really found success like this ever. For someone like Peter Parker, who's a socially awkward dweeb, I find it pretty believable that he would be so excited about it that he would even let it get to his head and embrace it almost to the point where he becomes too obnoxious. And despite kissing Gwen Stacy upside down, he does show regret for his actions later on, and tries to make things right with Mary Jane. He even shows regret for hurting Harry at the climax of the movie where Harry finally calls Peter his friend again. Now granted, his character arc doesn't feel quite as earned as it should be due to the overabundance of plot points, but you do get a sense of regret on his part, and he actually learns his lesson. Like I said, he manages to rekindle his friendship with Harry, and he even goes out of his way to forgive Flint Marko for killing Uncle Ben. Oh, by the way, people seem to find Peter nearly breaking down in tears at the bridge scene to be unintentionally funny. How would you feel if your significant other is dumping you for no reason? That's not funny. I was watching the scene, waiting for that moment where I actually start laughing. I wasn't laughing. I actually felt more sympathy for Peter than I did for Mary Jane. That's not funny, okay? So why is that? Right. I forgot. I'm sorry. It's because people don't like the way Tobey Maguire looks when he cries. That's right. That's why they find it funny. And Tobey is still reasonably funny in the film overall, especially in the black suit. And even as Spider-Man, he still has his funny quips, such as this.
Jig's up, pal.
I don't want to hurt you. Leave now.
I guess you haven't heard. I'm the sheriff around these parts.
And I honestly think he's very good at getting that confident and smooth, edgier side of the black-suited Peter Parker. And to Maguire's credit, he looks like he's having a total ball when he's playing the black-suited Peter Parker. I'm not trying to say that that's his best performance as the character, because as I said, Spider-Man 2 is where he holds that title in that regard. But he's clearly having the time of his life.
Stings, doesn't it?
Protected you in high school, now I'm gonna kick your little ass.
You want the shots, I'll take the staff job. Double the money. And lastly, this part.
Is everything okay here, Paul?
Yeah. Everything okay here, Paul?
Outside of all that, I still think Tobey really gives it his all and tries his best to make the character likable despite the fact that the writing of the character does not live up to his best efforts. And I find people who accuse Tobey of being terrible or something along the lines of like George Clooney in Batman and Robin to be a little bit naive and inconsiderate of how he was only doing what the script told him to do. I fail to see how anyone could accuse him of just up in one day deciding to phone in his performance, or essentially giving a big middle finger to the audience and to the fans, just because of a few dancing scenes. Shows you just how desperate people are to discredit anybody involved with the original trilogy because of the disappointment of Spider-Man 3. Now let's talk about Mary Jane. I like her in the first two movies. Despite the fact that I found her a little bit of a bitch in the second one, she still was reasonably likable nonetheless, and I thought it was a natural progression of the romance between her and Peter in the first two. But I have to say, I am very disappointed with how the romance turns out here. It starts off not too bad. She's happy with Peter, but we all know that it's not going to last very long. So it's like, okay, it's going to go south in some way, but we'll see how it goes. But then she starts getting negative reviews for her performance and finds a job as a singing waitress in a jazz club. Not exactly the most ideal job, but whatever. And despite Peter coming off as an oblivious idiot, sometimes with the romance, I actually find Mary Jane to be a lot more unsympathetic than Peter. As I said with the bridge scene, where she just dumps him for no reason, and he's really broken up over that. It's not just that, but she also accuses him of cheating on her after she sees him kiss Gwen Stacy upside down, which granted was a stupid move on his part, and he should have said something to her about Gwen being in her class, but for her to go as far as to accuse him of cheating, how shallow can you get? And not only that, when she talks to Peter about the bad review she has, he tries to sympathize with her saying, I know what it's like, Spider-Man gets attacked all the time. And she screams at him saying, don't give me the horse thing, understand how I feel, this is not about you. He wasn't saying it was about him. He's trying to tell you that he knew how you felt. How exactly is that him being selfish? But she also cheats on Peter by kissing Harry, and instead of warning Peter that Harry is forcing her to break up with him, she obeys his command nonetheless. Some of this stuff could have been really interesting and well done, but the way this whole movie is orchestrated, it makes her come off as a complete bitch. Now, none of this is Kirsten Dunst's fault. It really comes down to the writing, just like with the rest of the characters. Harry Osborn, I admittedly have an up and down feeling with Harry Osborn here, because I was ready for that rivalry to finally come to fruition ever since Spider-Man 1, where we finally see it in full force, because it's been built up from that point on onwards throughout the trilogy. But then when we see him walking out of the gas chamber after he supposedly takes the Goblin formula, it's a little bit like, huh? But at the moment, it's like, well, maybe he'll go a little crazy later on. Maybe he's like a delayed reaction, so okay. Then he attacks Peter Parker, and they fight it out over the city. But then during the fight, he gets amnesia, and he loses all of his memories of Peter being Spider-Man and his feelings towards Spider-Man. What? That is like one of the biggest cop-outs I have ever seen. Not to mention that Peter doesn't actually take the opportunity to tell Harry that it was his own father's fault. That's another thing that I wish they could have done. Anyway, sorry, I got distracted. All that excitement and build-up from Spider-Man 1 seeing Harry become the bad guy is now officially gone down the tubes with this amnesia plot point. Yet it does allow us to see some nice moments with Peter and Harry, such as them dribbling the basketball in Harry's penthouse, seeing their friendship go back to the way it was before all the jealousy came to fruition. Those I don't think are too bad. It's good stuff mostly, at least I think so. It's really hard for me to put into words how disappointed I was with how they handled Harry here, because like with Tobey Maguire and for Topher Grace, who we're going to talk about, James Franco does look like he's having fun doing it. But I was really bummed that we didn't get to see that rivalry finally going full blast like I had been envisioning ever since Spider-Man 1. And what is up with Harry's costume? Snowboarder? But you've probably heard that before. And Flint Marko, aka Sandman, played by Thomas Hayden Church. Sandman is one of the earliest foes that Spider-Man faced in the early comics, and issue number 4 is when he first appeared during the Stan Lee Steve Ditko era. And they change his backstory very drastically to where his daughter is stricken with a certain illness, and he becomes a petty criminal in order to steal certain things and to get the money that's required for his daughter to be cured. And all that stuff I think had a lot of great potential, particularly in 2 scenes. The one where he sneaks into his apartment to see his daughter again, and the scene where Sandman wakes up for the first time and tries to get the locket that his daughter gave to him before he left. But then the movie takes a big turn and reveals actually he was the one that killed Uncle Ben, not the other guy that Peter didn't stop at the arena. So if you're curious as to what I hate the most about Spider-Man 3, it's not the dancing scenes. It's Sandman killing Uncle Ben. Why do I hate it? Because there was never any intention from the beginning to have it be somebody else that killed Uncle Ben. This was clearly an afterthought. And my problem with it is that it takes the guilt off of Peter's shoulders completely, absolving him of this murder to begin with, when it's really Peter that is the one that should be indirectly responsible for his uncle dying by not stopping the crook when he should have. And the fact that they actually make it somebody else, that in my eyes is inexcusable, and it drives me nuts every time I watch the movie. But on the one hand, it does allow for an emotional payoff with him when Peter forgives him for what happened that night. It's a positive and a negative, so I hate the fact that they made him Uncle Ben's killer, but on the other hand, it does give us a slightly emotional payoff at the end. And Thomas Hayden Church, overall, from what I heard, he went through like a 16-month workout to get in shape. Major props to him. In this movie, he's fine with his performance, I guess. He's not the best. I think he does a fine job. Now let's talk about Eddie Brock, Venom. I admittedly was one of those people that wanted to see Venom in Spider-Man 3, despite the fact that I didn't really know much about him at the time, and only seen tidbits of him in the 90s show. And because the fans wanted to see him, the studio, along with the producer Avi Arad, basically told Sam Raimi, put Venom in this movie. The fans want Venom. And you've also heard that people hate Topher Grace as Eddie Brock. Even when he was first announced, I never really had that big of a problem with him. Yeah, he's not exactly a muscle guy like Eddie Brock usually is. He's a lot more scrawny, and I'm all for a new interpretation of said character as long as the key points are still there intact. And those things are actually still there. Eddie Brock is the new photographer at the Daily Bugle. Peter's having a hard time dealing with him. Then Eddie Brock claims that he caught Spider-Man in the act doing something that he shouldn't have done when it turned out it wasn't the case. Then Spider-Man exposes him as a fraud, or in this case Peter Parker exposes him as a fraud, and therefore Eddie Brock is not going to be hired by anybody because of it. So despite all the multiple stuff happening, some of that is still there, regardless. And while it's basically just Topher Grace being Topher Grace, and he does come off as annoying in certain scenes, such as when he talks to Jonah Jameson, "I want a staff job, sir. I have a girl that I intend to marry," and it's like, what are you, the biggest idiot in the world? You just went on a one date with her. But to his credit, though, Topher Grace is entertaining. He's got some really funny lines. Something called "Nice and Easy. What's on you?" It's called "Go Away." And probably my favorite moment with Eddie Brock is this scene.
See you, chump. What the hell?
Now, as far as Venom is concerned, his look is pretty awesome. They got his look exactly as it should. I mean, besides the fact that there's no white spider symbol, and I'm not really bothered by that necessarily, but his look is pretty much spot on, straight off the page. And also, the Black Spider-Man costume, I think, looks pretty cool too, despite the fact that looks very different from its counterpart. But Topher Grace's Venom, he's only in there for 5 minutes, as has been mentioned before, which really bummed me out at the time because they made such a big deal out of him being in here. And he's only in there for about 5 minutes to just make fans go, "Oh, we got Venom!" Oh, he's gone. Fans want to see Venom all the time with the Tobey Maguire series, the Amazing series. They're still asking for it now with the Tom Holland series. And to me, it's like they want to see a Venom story in every single incarnation of Spider-Man. He's everywhere now. Look, don't get me wrong, guys. I do like Venom. I do. But I actually think Venom is hugely overrated, and I'm probably going to upset some of you guys saying that. And yes, he is up there as far as arch nemesis of Spider-Man, but I think Green Goblin is Spider-Man's arch enemy. Now, I've only seen Venom in the 90s show and the Spider-Man PlayStation 1 video game from the year 2000. I get the appeal, guys. Venom is cool. I get that, because he's the doppelganger of Spider-Man and Peter Parker. But there's a couple problems that comes with including him in this trilogy. Sam Raimi has publicly said that he's not a Venom fan. So if you force a creative person to do something that their heart's not really in, then of course it's gonna suck. Had he been into the character beforehand, seeing what Sam Raimi did with Doc Ock, I reckon that Venom could have been something really cool in Spider-Man 3. And Sam Raimi does kind of incorporate some of that cool stuff with the handheld perspective of the symbiote sneaking up on Peter while he's in the bed. You can see the potential in there, but still, he's not a fan of the character. It probably was never going to be good to begin with, if he wasn't really that into him. And also, this is a 60s inspired Spider-Man series. That's why we went with Green Goblin, Doc Ock, and why he wanted Sandman, or to do the Vulture in Spider-Man 4. We want that classic Spider-Man feel, the Lee and Ditko era of Spider-Man villains. So you take the early 60s feel, but then you also take Venom, which is late 80s, early 90s, and you throw it in there, it doesn't fit. And because of that, it makes the tone feel very odd. It doesn't gel well, and it makes the tone feel very inconsistent to me. And he's an alien from outer space, okay? So this meteorite just so happens to land near Peter Parker. And it's like, where did that asteroid come from? So do aliens exist in this universe now? And another indicator that he doesn't fit is the opening credits sequence. Is Danny Elfman's original theme is playing, so okay, that's cool. But then the Venom theme shows up with the symbiote and the artwork and everything. That was one of the first indicators when I first saw this where I thought, this doesn't feel right. Now, again, I am not a hater of Venom. I do like Venom. He does have his value, he has his purpose, but people act like he's the greatest comic book villain of all time. And it drives me nuts. And the fact that they're still asking for Venom now, it's like, guys, let other villains take the spotlight for a while. We can wait on Venom, okay? Chill out. And some other characters, like Aunt May, doesn't really have a whole lot to do here. She just mostly is a voice of reason for Peter Parker. And I still like those scenes in the movie, nonetheless. They're some of my favorite parts, especially the engagement story that she tells Peter about when Uncle Ben first proposed to her. Her lesson on revenge and forgiveness and forgiving yourself. I like those scenes, but I wish they would have addressed whether or not she knew he was Spider-Man. It's kind of open-ended in Spider-Man 2, but they never address it in this one. It's one of the things I wish they would have done, but I still like those scenes nonetheless, and Rosemary Harris still gives it her all. Gwen Stacy, I like Bryce Dallas Howard, but she does not need to be in here. And it further adds to the love triangle that Peter and Mary Jane have here, so there's really no need for that. But also, you still got J.K. Simmons, who's still funny as ever, and it adds some of the funniest parts.
Not that one. Not that one.
You want a staff job? You want a staff job. Does anybody care about what I want? I do. Shut up. Get out. And of course, we got another cameo from Bruce Campbell as the maitre d', or however you say it. Table for two, Pekar, Parker. That is what I said. Pekar. And action-wise, you still have some really cool action sequences in here, such as the first fight between Harry and Peter. The crane sequence I don't think is that bad, not the best, but it's still fun nonetheless. And Spider-Man and Sandman's first encounter, which, a little tidbit for you guys, when Spider-Man punches Sandman, that was actually a stunt guy who lost his right hand, and they added the CGI effect later on. Now, I always thought that was kind of interesting how they did that. And also their second encounter in the subway tunnel, I think that's really cool, even though it's a little shorter than I would have expected. And the bare-knuckle fight between Harry and Peter in his apartment, I think is really cool, especially with that Halloween-like music, where you see the goblin blades get kind of close to Peter's eyes. And the musical score, Danny Elfman left the project after there was a falling out between him and Sam Raimi after Spider-Man 2. His original themes are still there in a lot of cases, and I'm always glad to hear that, but Christopher Young comes in and takes over, and his score is a little bit up and down for my liking. But some of his music, such as the scene where Sandman wakes up for the first time trying to touch that locket, it's beautiful, and it sucks you right into that moment, and it shows you the potential that Sandman could have had. And real quick, not to mention the CGI in that scene, flawlessly executed, and so much expression in his face, despite the fact that it's a sand figure. Back to the score. The Venom music... No, I'm not a big fan of that, especially in the opening credits scene, which I said, that was the first indicator where I thought, no, this doesn't feel right. But then there's also the score in the church tower scene where Peter rips the symbiote off of his body. That I think is kind of cool. That part of the Venom score I don't mind. Oh, and also the scene where Peter wakes up in the black-suited Spider-Man outfit, and that's one of my favorite parts in this movie. And I always thought it was a nice little homage to the 90s show where Peter wakes up in a similar fashion. When that black suit first showed up and the music started playing, da 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 da, I was going like this. So I thought it was kind of cool. Yeah, we're finally getting the black suit. Yes! Oh, and real quick, I'm sure some of you are probably going to say, well, Joe, he does throw the black costume away into his footlocker. Well, yeah, and he does look horrified by it, but he never really comes out and says, man, should I be wearing this thing or what's happening to me? And also, even in the scenes where Dr. Connors tells him it amplifies characteristics of its host, this could be dangerous. I think a little bit more emphasis on that would have helped us really get inside Peter's head. Now anyway, the special effects are still pretty good, and I think they improved as the trilogy went on, but some of the CGI in here is obviously dated, and there's so many close-ups of CGI rendered faces of Toby in the scene where he fights Harry for the first time, and then when he's falling down with Venom on the construction site, it really sticks out and it doesn't look good at all. And some of the green screen in the first fight with Harry and Peter, if you really look closely at it, it takes you right out of the movie. Now Sam Raimi's direction and the tone, I've said it before, he delivers on an action spectacle, and his off-kilter techniques with his filmmaking, it's still present in this movie to a certain extent. But I've always noticed that something about the overall vibe just kind of gave off a weird impression for me. Not just because of Venom being in here, but also you could clearly tell that Sony had their hands in the pot too much, and then there was also the fact that the writers were trying to come up with new plot points to introduce here, after everything seemed perfectly so wrapped up at the end of Spider-Man 2, minus Harry's plot point. It seems like all these pieces of the puzzle were just being thrown together, trying to make a connection in some way, and it doesn't really feel like one man's vision with other people's ideas to complement it like the first two. You could tell that everybody was in the kitchen trying to make this work in some way, especially with Sony interfering. But even so, despite all that interference, as I said earlier, Spider-Man 3 actually feels and plays like a movie, and has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's not a big commercial for future sequels or some big giant product placement feature for Sony Vios or whatever. And despite what some people may have you believe, there is no malice involved on Sam Raimi's part or anybody else in the cast and crew. They all tried to make this the best movie they could, despite all the interference and all the writers trying to figure out what they were doing. It's not Sam Raimi's fault, and it's certainly not Tobey Maguire's fault either. To assume that Sam Raimi up in one day decided to give a giant middle finger to the audience, I find that to be really naive and completely childish on anybody's part who accuses him of that. And I've heard Sam Raimi say how disappointed he was in how Spider-Man 3 turned out, because I know that he wanted to make the best movie possible, and to hear people blame him and the rest of the team for making the movie turn out this way, it makes me boil inside a little bit, because he said before that Sony basically forced him to put Venom in the movie when he didn't want to. Or you know what? Maybe it was the fact that the pesky fans were so demanding of seeing Venom, which later caused the studio to force Sam Raimi to put Venom in here. Have you ever considered that? That maybe it was the fans' fault? Ponder that for a second.